Hello and welcome back to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University. This is my colleague and co-host, Sam Wang.
Hey there, Sam Wang, professor of neuroscience, also founder of the Princeton Election Consortium.
So we are really living in the middle of a very important, significant, and dramatic moment in the history of civil rights. And this comes at the not end, but at the end of the first phase, perhaps, of the pandemic and different states of the government trying to deal with it. We have seen mass protests throughout the country in different places, revolving around the question of policing and racial justice, and the question of institutional racism, which has been an issue for decades, but one element certainly of the civil rights struggle, which most experts agree has not really been addressed. And policing remains at the heart of this. It was at the heart of the Kerner Commission in 1968, and at the heart of many government investigations of institutional racism, and it's in front of us today, all starting with a series of videos a few weeks ago, which included the death of George Floyd at the hands of police. And this has opened up policy debates about policing and how do we change policing? How do we reform policing? Do we defund policing? What exactly do we do to move toward a better place? And we have a terrific guest with us today, Alex Vitale, who is a professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College, also a visiting professor at London Southbank University. He spent 25 years writing about policing. He's worked with human rights organizations, with police departments. He serves on the New York State Advisory Committee of the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights, and he is the author of City of Disorder: How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics and the End of Policing. And he's also written many academic pieces, as well as pieces in newspapers such as the New York Times and USA Today. So, Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys.
Well, maybe we can just start by having you help us work through the different options that are on the table and the different ideas. And my first question is one I hear often. Is it possible to keep the existing police system that we have throughout the country and substantially reduce, if not eliminate, the kind of brutal acts that we have now seen over the years?
Yeah, so that's kind of a core issue here, right? That comes down to whether or not we can implement a series of procedural reforms and accountability measures that would substantially reduce the violence without addressing the expanded scope of policing. And obviously my position to this is no, that these procedural reforms are inadequate to the task, as are the accountability measures, and in part because they A, misunderstand the nature of the problem, and B, they misunderstand the nature of the harms that are inflicted upon those who are subjected to this intensified and broadening scope of policing. So maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the specific things that have been proposed. Or do you want to start with some of the stuff in the Obama administration proposal?
Yeah, but I mean, just so people understand on that point that you just made, one discussion you often hear in terms of the problem itself, before we get to the solution, is the militarization of policing and new kinds of equipment and techniques. But again, the Kerner report talked about this in 1968, long before we had the kinds of equipment we have today. What is it? Maybe you can explain about policing that inherently creates these kinds of dangers and situations.
Right. And, your colleague, Naomi Morikawa in the African American Studies Department wrote a great book called The First Civil Right that addresses the Kerner Commission and the kind of fundamental flaws in their approach to the problem. But I think the problem here is that there's a kind of misunderstanding about the nature of policing as an institution in relationship to other potential governmental and non-governmental institutions. And what distinguishes policing is that they are violence workers. You know, they're the people that you call when you need the ability and authorization to use violence. And while they manage to avoid that use of violence in the majority of encounters, their authority rests on that capacity. So when we introduce police into a situation, right, we're introducing that capacity for violence. And that's one of the inherent deficiencies of turning all these social problems over to the police to manage, and then for politicians to rest their reforms on things like de-escalation training and mindfulness training is to pretend that police aren't violence workers.
So in your book, in The End of Policing, you give a short history of various police forces going all the way back to the London police, to Texas Rangers, and so on. And what's striking to me is this pattern that you talk about I guess I would charitably call it keeping order, where the idea is to, as you say, use violence or use the threat of violence to keep order. I guess, Mike, I'm curious about, in your review of all that, is there some version of what one could call policing that emphasizes non-use of violence? I mean, you start off with the Bobbies and Sir Robert Peel. So is there some positive example we can look to where it was relatively successful and relatively avoidant of violence?
Well, I mean, we can talk about degrees of violence, right? In the UK and much of Europe, we still have police that are not armed, where shootings by police are very rare. And that's certainly, you know, preferable. But that doesn't mean that there's not violence and that there aren't deaths in custody and that the institution doesn't still rest on that capacity. And there are historical reasons, right, why American policing has been so much more violent than European policing. And I would argue that's because, you know, American policing rests on domestic projects of slavery and colonialism that for European countries, those problems were exported. So that the violence, the torture, that was happening in the West Indies, that was happening in Africa, that was happening in Southeast Asia, rather than domestically in the way that it was in the United States. So, you know, my argument is that the violence is often proportional to the inequality that the social order rests on in a particular context.
Are there, I mean, I think of Europe as, up until a few decades ago, as being lower on diversity than the United States. And so I'm just trying to think of what examples we can look to as, I see some broader problem here, which is we have slavery that's the legacy of slavery that's very much with us, but we are heading towards this multicultural society. And I'm trying to think of an example of a society that has successfully made the transition from being predominantly one ethnicity to multi-ethnic, and done so peacefully and relatively in an egalitarian manner. Brazil?
Oh no, my God, Brazil is a horrible example, right? Brazil
Great.
has death squads that are rounding up homeless youth and killing them extrajudiciously, very high rates of police shooting. So really they have a mammoth problem there, and entrenched, you know, organized
Right.
corruption within the ranks.
So my point is, are we on our own here? I mean, like what exactly is the path to finding a way to get away from these core problems?
So, I mean, the first step, right, is to acknowledge that police are not the solution to every problem under the sun, that when we introduce policing, that represents both the introduction of problematic tools and also, I would argue, a set of political failures. So what we've got to do, right, is begin to address these regimes of exploitation that are built into our kind of neoliberal austerity politics that has produced problems like mass homelessness, widespread untreated mental illness, lack of access to high quality medicalized drug treatment, failed schools, et cetera, which then get, turned over to the police to manage. And that process reproduces race and class inequalities and also allows the continuance of a set of economic relations that are pushing wealth up the economic ladder.
And then you mentioned earlier a question about Obama. And this has now been a debate. I think President Trump introduced the idea he's done more than President Obama on this issue. I can't remember the exact wording. But what did the Obama administration do? This was on the table. Black Lives Matter Matters takes form during his presidency. Did Attorney General Holder, did the administration make any progress on this issue?
Not much. I mean, they put effort into it, and they tried to change the narrative a little bit, but not in ways that are helpful. Having beer with a police officer accused of misconduct on the lawn of the White House is not how we're going to solve this problem, and neither is implicit bias training, police community encounter sessions, and even body cameras. And these were the kinds of procedural reforms that were included in Obama's task force on 21st century policing. And, Minneapolis, for instance, they adopted almost all of these reforms, and it just didn't make any difference because it assumes that the problem here is just a lack of professionalization, and that this is about, finding those few bad apples in policing and either retraining them or disciplining them or firing them. And it does nothing to address the underlying political imperatives that have driven all these problems into the lap of the police to manage.
Can I ask, is this about racism, or is it about the nature of policing as violence workers that's at the heart of the problem? And I understand the two are connected, but does it in some ways go beyond the racial issue?
So it is really hard to unpack them, right? Because systems of economic exploitation in the United States have always been racialized. When my family came here from Sicily, 125 years ago, they were subjected to racialized abuse. Their unions were attacked, their livelihoods were suppressed, and they were subjected to KKK violence. So, as Italian Americans and Irish Americans achieve whiteness, their social status changes and new groups are racialized and put at the bottom of this pyramid. So even when we think we're dealing with something that appears more race neutral, like the policing of unions and workers' movements in the North, those groups were historically racialized. So it's really hard to see how this can be separated out in the American context at the very least.
And so at the heart of the movement right now, and sorry for the siren, is the notion of defunding the police. And many people have not heard this before, and it's been remarkable to see how this has taken hold. Can you walk us through what does that mean? For many people, it's unclear. Does that mean just no police at all? Does it mean changing the funding? What does defund the police refer to?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a difficult situation because, these movements have been around for a while, but it's hard to describe what they're calling for on a protest sign or in a hashtag. Mm-hmm. And defund the police was a shorthand for capturing this idea that we have a fundamental political problem, especially at the local level, where ever increasing resources are going into policing, while communities experience that as abuse, as unsafety, and they want resources shifted from policing to a community-identified public safety initiatives that the community thinks will do a better job of keeping them safe. So in its simplest terms, it's about shifting funding from policing and jails and youth facilities, lockups, into community-based initiatives to do violence reduction work, to improve mental health services, to house people living on the streets.
Are there cities in America where this has been either tried or used successfully? Like, can we think of examples where steps have been taken forward? Camden or, other cities?
Well, that's not what happened in Camden. What happened in Camden was that they, wanted to hire more police and expand the scope of policing. And to do that, they needed to break the union to bring down salaries and get past work rules, et cetera. So that's not what we're talking about. We don't have examples in the US of this. What we have is that 40, 50 years ago, police were not in charge of all these things. And civilization, chugged right along. And we can look internationally at places like Portugal that have decriminalized drugs and turn that problem over to the public health system to manage. Throughout Europe, there's no school policing. In the UK, if you have a mental health crisis, you call the National Health Service and get a clinical response. In New Zealand, parts of Australia, there are no vice units, sex work has been legalized, et cetera.
So it's not just defunding, it's also distributing power. Somehow along the way, we as a nation have put more and more power into the police, whether it be, credentialing journalists in New York City or whatever it might be. Seems like we've put a lot of functions into this one agency.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think that this has served a set of political interests, and we can see this most clearly with the drug war, where the Nixon administration creates this federal law enforcement initiative as part of his Southern strategy to win over white, historically Democratic voters to the Republican Party in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. It had nothing to do with public health, nothing to do with public safety. It was just a rancid racial politics.
Okay, but I'm just going to be the idealist here, which is kind of, I'm sure you're going to school me on this. But why couldn't one take a reformist point of view where pass legislation, civilian oversight over police, people run for local office, running on a platform of distributing these powers and responsibilities? Because one thing that we've seen in the last few weeks is that public opinion has really shifted a lot in support for Black Lives Matter, and it feels like it could be a better turning point than we've seen in quite a long time.
Well, I think there are some, quote, reforms that might function as a kind of harm reduction strategy that might have some effect on the level of violence, getting rid of chokeholds, ending no-knock raids. But most of these things have no empirical evidence to support them. They have not worked historically.
Is there negative empirical evidence that shows that they don't work, or is it just that they?
So let's look at like hiring more African-American police officers, diversifying police. We've got a lot of evidence that doesn't work. Implicit bias training clearly doesn't work. Community policing is not producing better outcomes.
Okay, but what about doing away with qualified immunity? That seems like a good move. What about?
Well, that's a question mark, right? I think we don't know what the effect of that would be because it hasn't been done.
By the way, we should probably explain to everybody what qualified immunity is, since I didn't really know what it was until about a week ago.
Yeah, so police officers are indemnified by local government so that if they commit misconduct while carrying out their official duties, any civil judgments against them will be borne by local government. The problem is that there are places that already have exceptions to this rule that say that, it doesn't count if the officer was engaged in a violation of proper rules and procedures, but then they never follow through on it. And courts have been reluctant to bring these damages against individual officers. So I'm somewhat skeptical of that. I'm not opposed to it. But it doesn't, that again, only is designed to address acts of gross violence. It doesn't deal with the fact that a totally procedurally proper, lawful, low-level drug arrest is still going to ruin someone's life for no good reason.
And can the alternative mechanisms contain the violence that can unfold in community. So our colleague here, Patrick Sharkey, had an op-ed about this, I think in the Washington Post. And he starts with the warning of the immense damage violence can inflict on children, not just physically, but psychologically on the entire fabric of a community. And he pointed to some evidence that, when policing is reduced, this goes up. So how do we know that there are alternatives that can contain the problems in better ways than policing can?
Well, I think Patrick has really overstated the literature that shows that certain interventions that involve relying on police produce public safety in a widespread way. I mean, the measurements here, the magnitude of the effects is quite small. They're usually dealing with only one or two measures of what counts as an improvement. But having said that, no one in this movement is calling for what he describes, which is that one day there are no police. We just pull the police out. So it's a bit of a fake straw man, right? So yes, obviously the complete absence of police or any other structure of maintaining public safety would lead to problems, obviously. But that's not what people are calling for. They're calling for the building up of alternative infrastructure so that we can dial back our reliance on policing. And that the other problem with a lot of the stuff that Sharkey refers to is that it never calculates the other side of the equation, which is what are the costs of using police? So that even if we get some reduction in a type of crime, that comes with the costs of violence, harassment, and incarceration. And those are very real costs. And even things like stop and frisk have produced measurable negative health outcomes for those who are associated with them. So for some reason, that part of the equation is always just completely left out of these studies.
But these are things that somebody could run on as a local platform. I can imagine like public officials running for council or DAs or whoever. It feels to me like that there might be finally energy for local political action to start chipping away at these things. That's
happening. I mean, that's part of why Minneapolis was able to produce this supermajority for change.
Right.
Is because this has been happening. In New York, over 50 candidates for next year's city council elections have signed a pledge to cut the police budget by $1 billion and reinvest it. So there is a generation of politicians out there, some of them associated with Democratic Socialists of America, some of them independent, who are actually moving in this direction. And I get calls every day from such candidates to try to help articulate what this new vision of public safety and really justice would look like for a more popular conversation, in a specific community.
I want to get back just a little bit to something that in the ideal case is less common, but it's always looming in the background, the militarization of police. And it gets to the end of policing. So we spend a lot of time talking about civilian alternatives and ways that don't involve violence at the forefront. But then there's the end in which the use of guns, the explicit circumstance of using guns. And I'm wondering, I have a couple of questions. My first one is, could an improvement be made by doing away with this program called Section 1033? Basically the routing of military surplus to police departments to let them militarize in their training, their tactics, their equipment. Like that feels like it could be maybe, I wouldn't say low-hanging fruit, but a pretty significant improvement.
Yes, I mean, I think that is definitely something that should be done. There are some bills under development in Congress right now to eliminate not just Section 1033, which was created in the 90s to allow the direct transfer of federal surplus weapons and other DoD materials to local police, but also Homeland Security grants and other things that allow them to directly purchase this material. Mm-hmm. And I'm all for that and for reducing these paramilitary SWAT units. But the problem of police militarization also includes training and ultimately is tied to the political mission that's been given to police to wage a war on crime and a war on drugs and a war on gangs and a war on terror, right? So it's put the police on this war footing. And I think that, that is a substantial part of this problem.
Well, let me get on the topic of war per se. It strikes me that in the United States, there's an unusual problem, which is that we have more guns per capita in the hands of civilians than I think any country. And it strikes me that we are in a situation where there actually needs to be a public force to be ready for dealing with militias or other kinds of people who would like to commit violence. So then what?
So first of all, I'm for some improvements to gun control, whatever we can do to get guns off the street, but not whatever we can do. I mean, in terms of controls on the production and distribution of guns, but these are supply side strategies. And I think what we need to talk more seriously about are demand side strategies. Why are people buying, carrying, and using all these guns? This is about a set of social and political problems that remain unaddressed. Unaddressed mental health problems, unaddressed legacies of racism in American society that produce this sense of insecurity. The way the war on drugs has created this massive underground economy where guns are used for self-protection and to resolve business disputes. So I would like to see a lot more done to address these demand side issues. Ultimately, if we understand police as violence workers, I've always been clear that there may be some need for a state capacity to mobilize some level of violence. But that's not really what police are doing day in and day out, right? They're chasing homeless people, going on mental health crisis calls, staffing schools, and all that stuff we could do better in other ways.
I guess the last time I interacted with a cop, let's see, we found some bullets in the house. We wanted somebody to take them. Another time, I live in a boring town. And another time there was a squirrel in our chimney and the animal control officer was off. God knows where he was. And so the cop came in and we chased the squirrel around the house with a broom. And I got to say, I'm clearly pretty sheltered because I was not scared of the cop coming into my house, and we were pretty chuffed about getting rid of the squirrel. So I think I'm really grasping the idea that maybe these don't need to be handled by people with guns.
Yes, and also I suspect the other likely form of interaction would have to do with a traffic stop in your community. Yes. And that's another function that should not be handled by armed police.
But what happens if say this moves forward in a lot of cities and the funding is reallocated, there's a reduction in policing and a reduction in what police do, but these other services that I would suspect would be more vulnerable over the long term politically, they're not the kinds of programs that often have certainly strong conservative support. What if those then suffer the kind of funding cuts we've seen in social safety net programs, and communities are left with less policing, less alternative forms of containing and reducing violence? Is there a risk there because of the politics, not the policy, of how this could all unfold for these areas?
Well, of course. I mean, part of the problem has been that these kinds of community interventions are always treated as a kind of soft money. It's somebody's pet project, it's some form of patronage to a community group, and it's always the first thing cut in hard times. That's what we've been seeing, in fact, this year. While policing is hard money, it's wired into the baseline of the budget. So absolutely, we need to do things to wire this into hard money, to create an office of community safety that has its own baseline budget that is wired into the structure of city government that helps to oversee, monitor, evaluate, supervise, be a conduit for money, et cetera, and that institution needs to be independent of the criminal justice system.
It's not obvious to me that these things naturally always follow on liberal conservative lines. Like there's a bill to do away with Section 1033 transfers of armaments. and that's Brian Schatz from Hawaii, a Democrat, and Rand Paul, a Republican from Kentucky. There's that. There's another bill on race and policing that Tim Scott, a black senator from South Carolina, a Republican. It feels to me like there is conceivably a way forward, especially given the current political time, that might actually be able to cross party lines, said the idealistic academic.
Well, I think most of the discussion in Washington has not been very helpful and has not been responsive to this movement in any meaningful way. I do understand that there's more stuff in the wings, and I think there is the possibility of some common cause with the libertarian wing of the Republican Party.
Right.
That brings with it a certain skepticism about excessive state power and unregulated state power, and including things like rolling back qualified immunity. So there is some potential there, but I think we've got a long way to go on that.
So we're almost out of time, but let me end just getting your idea of a next concrete step from someone who's studied this, who's worked with police units, who's worked with human rights groups. Say in New York, where you're most familiar with, what would you be looking for in the next year as really concrete measures, either in the city or at the state level, to move toward the kind of agenda you've been talking about?
I think what needs to happen is for these movements out on the street to do the hard work of community organizing, to convene their neighbors, to talk concretely about what the public safety challenges are that they face, and to begin that process of laying out what the alternatives to policing might be that could actually win broad support within the community, and then pulling that together into a kind of people's budget that calls concretely for dialing back policing and jails and redirecting that money into these community identified initiatives.
Well, we are out of time, but that's a useful way, I think, to end the conversation. And I think part of what people will be looking for in the next few weeks and months to move this toward the next level. I want to thank our guest again, Alex Vitale, who is a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. I mentioned he's the author of City of Disorder, and he's also the author of The End of Policing, which is out with Verso Books. And
currently free.
And oh, wow. Currently free and available everywhere, though. And definitely worth a read as we get into this conversation, which will, I am sure, be unfolding for some time to come. So thanks so much for joining our show.
You bet. Thanks, Julian. Thanks, Sam.
Once again, you can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can also get our archives at the website, politicspolls.princeton.edu, with all the information you need, as well as the Woodrow Wilson School website, which always has our latest show. So thanks, everyone, for joining us, and we'll be back soon on Politics and Polls. Politics and Polls.
Bye, everybody.